glad to have Scott Aspelin back with us to talk about finances, financial coach. Last time you talked with us about our emotions, our relationship with money, and our identity. So today we'll go a little more practical. What's one of the top practices or a place to begin with people as you are talking about money?
Sure. Yeah. One of the first places I'd like to start is kind of going back to that first video. Like I said, when people watch that one first, in the beginning of the video, we talked about what things come to mind as far as feelings or emotions when you think about money. And that the top one I mentioned that most people have when they think of money is stress or anxiety. It's very common amongst all income levels. This is not in all genders, all races. It crosses the board. So because stress and anxiety is one of the most common things people deal with, I like to start by talking about what I think is one of the first steps, not the only step, but the first step to de-stress our financial lives. To do that, most commonly when stress comes at us in our financial life, it's typically from something that comes at us that we didn't plan for. Something comes at you, that car breaks down, your air conditioner home breaks down, medical something, your kid fell and broke his arm or something. Any number of things we could think of that could happen, that you can call it an emergency, that's fine, but something unplanned that happens, right? So when that happens, if somebody doesn't have money to cover that, now you've taken a stressful situation and making it doubly stressful by not having money prepared to do that. So I like to talk about the first step, which this is not, again, a lot of people talk about this, but I'm a firm believer of having some emergency fund, some buffer between you and life, because life is coming at you every day. I'm not trying to be a doomsday guy, but things happen, right? It's not a matter of if, it's when the next thing happens. So when that thing happens, how do we prepare for that? And it's having a dedicated emergency fund ready to go.
Okay. So I like the idea of that. I've had that in my history. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. Why not just have a credit card and use that to pay things off?
Well, that's a good question, because that comes up a lot. People say, well, I've just got a credit card in case of emergency.
An emergency credit card.
Right. It's like, well, I'm only going to use it in case of emergency. And the emergency fund I'm talking about, just to clarify the first question a little bit more, I'm talking about a starter emergency fund. And yes, it's great to have 3 or 6 months of your income ready. That we'll get to that later. But we want to get through the first step. Let's get the first buffer between you and life. So I'm talking about, it could be anywhere depending on someone's life situation. Maybe it's $500 to $1,000. Enough to cover, maybe it can cover that medical bill, can cover a reasonable car repair. It may not cover a new roof on your house, but it's going to cover a lot of things that could break. Yes, some people will say, hey, I can put $500,000 on my credit card.
500,000?
500 or 1,000. Sorry. Yes, big difference. Thanks, Chris. Yes, big difference. If you have that credit line, that's a difference.
Then you don't need to be watching this video.
You're not watching the right video. We need to watch your video. But yes, if you're looking to put 500 or 1,000 on a credit card, people say, well, that's not that much money. I can do that. And in theory, it's not. If, the big if is if you have the money to pay for it when that bill comes at the end of the month. And that's where people can really get into trouble with credit cards sometimes, is they say, well, I've got this credit card. I'm only going to use it in an emergency. Well, then that emergency happens and they put it on there. Well, then let's say it's August. And it's like, well, oh gosh, I need to get some back to school clothes for my kids. Go to the store, swipe it again. Or that emergency happens in November. Okay, well, I got grandma, I got all the cousins coming over for Thanksgiving. We got to get some food. Swipe it again. Then the bill comes in December, and they're like, well, shoot, I've got to get Christmas presents now. Swipe it again. It keeps going, and we want to be positive about it and tell ourselves, well, I can pay it off next month. I will totally pay this off next month. And there are definitely people that do. So I'm not saying that nobody ever pays off their credit cards, by no means. But because of the ease of being able to do that, a lot of us tell ourselves, well, I'm just going to use this for an emergency. But then when that emergency happens, they don't have the plan of how to pay for it when the bill comes. So that's what I'm talking about, is having that buffer ready to go. And I like to tell people to actually have it in a dedicated, separate account, separate from your regular checking account where all your income comes in, your bills come out, separate from that. Have it in a separate institution even. So you want to have a little hurdle between you and that money. Still kind of easy to get to in our day and age, with digital banking and phone apps and things like that. But you want to have a hurdle to get to it. And when you set it up in that other bank, most banks will allow you to do this now. Give it a textual name. Call it an emergency fund. Give it a name, not just account, 45872. Well, who knows what that is? Call an emergency fund, and you know that is my emergency fund. When I need it, I pull it back over to but there's that hurdle to get to it. So it's not just forgetting your spouse's birthday, for example. I've heard someone, well, my wife is going to kill me if I forget her birthday. Well, technically it's not an emergency because her birthday's the same day every year. So, while she may hurt you, I hope not. But
So, how do I start an emergency fund?
sure. And that's right. Well, once we talked about where you started that extra account, it's like, I've got my account, I'm going to put it in. And even if I've had some people that even as they started, I had one woman who said, I put it in a shoebox under my bed. Okay, well, I wouldn't do that for too long, but still, let's get this thing started now. So if your goal is, $500 or $1,000, okay, how are you going to start to do that? Well, people say, well, my budget's so tight. I'm living paycheck to paycheck.
Which is most pastors I know, myself included.
And not just pastors, there's a lot of people in America as well. And what paycheck to paycheck means, for those, just to clarify the term, is it means you have just enough, or barely enough, to pay for the things you have while that paycheck comes, and then the next, there's nothing extra. So that's what paycheck to paycheck essentially means. So when you say that, it's like, okay, how am I going to save $500 or $1,000?
Right.
And this is exactly where your first hard choice, you could call it a sacrifice, comes in. How bad do I want this? So am I willing to give up, maybe it is dining out for this other time. It could be more income coming in, or it could be less expenses going out. Some combination of the two, but you want to have a plan and say, I'm consciously saying, I'm going to do or not do this thing. So maybe it is, some people, depending on, some pastors may be bivocational, some may have side gigs, or your spouse may have ability to work a little extra hours, or it could be any number of things. It's not always easy to just get more income. Those may take a little time, but sometimes you can. You can sell something. We've all got stuff sitting around in attics, basements. We've got stuff that probably some of it still has value. How in love with you are we with that stuff versus having that buffer between us and life? So that's usually one of the easiest ways, is to just sell some stuff. Like I said, you can make the choice this week. Say, well, as a family, we normally do this on the weekend. We normally do this, and it costs this much. We're going to make a choice as a family to say, you know what, we're going to do it differently, and we're going to put that money here.
So clearly, our relationship with money and our practices, even building an emergency fund, I see this as a spiritual practice because it's about our relationship with God, self, money, and all things. So one of the questions about building an emergency fund, wouldn't it be wise to pay off credit card debt before I go about building an emergency fund?
And that's another very popular concept, really good question. So I'm glad you brought it up, because my personal opinion, again, not that you have to always do what Scott says, but the reason I like to put emergency fund in front of starting to pay off the debt is because when you have that buffer, by having that buffer, when that thing comes along while you're then paying off your debt, that buffer is protecting you from putting more debt on your credit card. So that's what we're really trying to do, is that's the buffer between more debt getting added on there, because that debt now comes with a high interest rate. So that's what we're trying to avoid. That's why I do like to recommend to put the emergency fund as your first step. Then we can start working on the budgeting to be able to start paying off the debt.
Okay, so speaking of budgeting,
yes.
So building an emergency fund is the first step, building this buffer between me and us and life and the things that come at us. So I hear that. Now, I hear a second step is building a budget. Talk to us. Where do we start?
It's really no more than a cash flow plan. If you'd like to talk about it like that.
A cash flow plan.
You've got cash, sometimes it's digital, but still you've got cash flow coming in, and you're saying, how is it going to flow out? So it's really just a cash flow plan. Budget, sometimes that word's been co-opted as a bad thing in our society.
There are emotions with that word as well.
There's absolutely emotions with that word. Sometimes budgets have been used to kind of talk down to people and things like that. So I understand, but however you want to refer to it with however a pastor or a couple want to refer to it, it's your choice. But the principles we're going to talk about are the same. First, you have to be very honest about where your money is currently going. And to do that is you have to do a look back to say, okay, where has my money gone? And I recommend at least a 3-month look back. You have to do that look back, and that's where I want people to do a very detailed look back. I have a chart that I I can provide the resource that we have here. It just has a lot of long listing of categories names. It could be things from rent, the different utility bills, very specific, groceries, dining out, the specific things for your, different insurances you pay, all these different specific things. So you have a detailed list, and you have to go through. It's going to take some time. It's kind of like doing a deep dive into your past finances. But without that information, you don't know where you have to start with that awareness level. That's where we've got to start. So we have to be aware and fully honest with ourselves of, okay, where have I been spending my money? And until you have that honesty, and again, some people really fear that because they fear a little bit, again, back to the emotional side, is people fear what they're going to find out. It's like, where really have I been spending money? Maybe I don't really want to know where I'm spending my money. So some people will say, oh, well, my bank will give me a summary of the categories. Some will. It's generally not a broad range of categories. That's why I don't like it. It can be your first step, and then you have to get more specific. But they may give you 8 to 10 categories, very generic. I don't hate banks, but generally they're not in the business of wanting you to be more responsible with your money. They will give you a little bit of information, but you need to take, you and the pastors, you need to take responsibility for yourself and say, I'm going to get very detailed with where my money is going, so I fully know. Now I can be informed, and then start the next step, which is where do I start making those decisions and those choices and trade-offs.
It seems like with so many practices, as you mentioned, it begins with awareness, and honesty.
Yes.
Be it food, so many habits, so many things in our lives, and I hear that applying here as well.
You're absolutely right. It's becoming fully aware of where we are, and
where we've been, where we are,
and that's where when I talk about with personal finance with people, everybody is coming from a different place and going a different place. So that's why it is personal finance.
Yeah.
It's very personal, and while there are some common things we talk about, it is in that we have to cover that apply to most people or almost all people. How you execute those things is where that personal piece comes in. The choices you're going to make about your budget will be different than the choices I'll make, and that's okay, because you have different identity, you have different priorities, you have different family situation, all those different things that I have. I've had people approach me and say, well, Scott, just write my budget for me. I say, I can't. I could, but I won't, because if I write a budget for you, you won't follow it. Likewise, if you wrote one for me, I'm not going to follow it. You have to be the one who, after you have that awareness, now you're taking the steps to remedy it. And only you know and have the priorities and identity for you.
So once I've been honest and become more aware about how I have been spending money, then what?
Okay, so now we're going to walk through a little demo on how to do the budget, how to start to build your budget and create one. So the first resource we talked about is you're going to have a resource available where you can go back and do a look back and dig through. Now you start with and say, okay, on the very top of the sheet, there's 2 things at the top of the sheet I like to put on there. One of them is, what's my goal this month? Maybe the goal is I want to start my emergency fund, or I'm going to put blank amount, 200, 300, whatever, towards my emergency fund this month. That's my top goal. Put that at the top. Have a big blank for it. Below that, then you start with, okay, what's the money I have coming in? You start with the income. So you put up there, if it's a consistent income, you'll see there's a box for salary, that kind of thing. There's additional things that people have side work, or maybe they sold something. Well, that's money that's come in, right? The biggest piece of information you're going to gather from that is, what I tell people is, after they do that 3-month look back, I come back and say, okay, when you were honest about where your money is going, what was one area that jumped out at you or surprised you? Could have surprised you to the low side, or it could have surprised you to the high side, but just what surprised you? There's a few popular ones that people come up with, but there'll be something that will usually be a focus point of, wow, I didn't know I was spending that much in that area, when I really got honest with it. And again, we're doing this prior to the month happening. This is proactive step. Either sheet is doing it for you, or you're tallying it. Here's all my income, and then you've tallied up everything else you plan to spend. Again, that's the budget side. Now, typically for your first budget, what you plan to spend is usually typically going to be higher than what you have coming in. At that point, people start to panic sometimes, or there's some anxiety, their heart rate goes up. Well, don't have to panic too much yet, because the money hasn't been spent. The month hasn't happened yet. So you have an opportunity to go through there now and make, again, this is where you hear me say it a lot more, the choices and trade-offs. Okay, I know that I need to put 100 or 200 to my emergency fund, because there's a line for that on the form. And then go down and say, okay, well, I'm gonna make a choice to eat out only maybe spend $100 on dining out this month instead of 500 like I was doing. Just maybe that's what it was. So that's a choice you make, and you keep making those choices. Again, these are not easy choices always, but they have to be choices. Some of them may be sacrifices. Some of them may just be a sacrifice for that month. Some of them may need to be continuous. It just depends. To get those numbers to match. So then when those two numbers match, let's say it's, just use a round number, you've got, 3,000 coming in and 3,000 going out. And this is the coming in, I should say, just one clarification point. This is your take-home pay. Taxes, any insurance, anything like that. We only want to see what comes home to you. That's the amount of money that people have to work with. So you start with that number at the top. So if there's 3,000 coming home after all the taxes and all that good stuff, then you need to make sure there's 3,000 at the bottom. Or just using a round number, whatever it is. So now it's like people think, I'm done. I've got a budget, right? I'm good. And they may slide it over, or it gets piled on in the stack at their office or by the phone or computer at home. It's like, okay, well, got that done, right? Not exactly. Now, the real strength of a budget comes in, how did you do? And the only way to know how you did is you have to periodically track it. No different than if someone has say, I want to lose 10 pounds. Well, if they never get on the scale, they never know how they're doing. They can easily track that. I recommend weekly, and you'll see on the resource I'll send, there's columns to the side that'll be 1, 2, 3, 4, week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4, week 5. And I recommend people track per week what you spent in that category.
So once I have set up a budget, then I'm done, right?
Not exactly. You've got a really good start, though. So setting up that budget, you've got your numbers in the budget column, your income and your outgo or your expenses all line up, right? That's where you've got your perfect start. So, okay, now on to the next. You're going through the month, things are happening, right? So where the piece of budgeting that unfortunately a lot of people will miss, some people will say, oh, I made my budget, so at the end of the month, I'll just check back, see how I did. Well, unfortunately, at that point, the money's all been spent, and you don't know how you did. Did you spend more or did you spend less? So what I recommend people do is weekly track what you spend, and that's why on that resource I've got column 1 that says week 1, then there's week 2, week 3, week 4, week 5. So in each of those columns for each category, you'll go through and track what you've spent in that area. Go back into your checking account, your debit card, all the different places where your money is coming out, and just an honest look at it. Just you're recording the data first, but it doesn't just stop at recording the data. Now you've got this data of what we spent, but then especially as you get into week 1, week 2, week 3 and 4 get interesting, because then you may see, oh wow, we're bumping up pretty close to what we said we budgeted $800 for groceries this month. Well, we're at week 3. We've already spent $750. Okay, well that's where the tracking data is only there to inform the last piece of that weekly tracking, which is a discussion. Maybe you have to go back into your budget and say, well, I thought I was going to buy some clothing this month. I need a new pair of shoes. Well, I'm going to wait till next month because we really need to do this other thing. So I'm going to move some money. That's totally okay. That's part of the budgeting process. Is as you go through the month, you may have to move things. We're not looking for perfection here. That's not what it's about. But it's about informing how you're doing. So have that discussion with your spouse. How do we do this week? Okay. Maybe we need to do more here, less here. Maybe we don't. Let's get our groceries at this store this week, or can we wait till next week? Maybe when the next paycheck. Those are all very real discussions that have to happen. So it's not, oh well, we just need this, put it on the credit card, for example. If that's just kind of the fallback that people might have. So again, having that discussion, that is where the real power of the tracking comes in. And the people that I coach, it usually takes, on average, it's about 15 to 20 minutes for the tracking and the discussion. So some people set it up at a time, sometimes put it on their own calendars with each other. There's usually one time in the week where maybe kids are in bed, whatever it is, whatever works for somebody. But find something that works for you and your family on when to do that tracking, because that is super, super critical.
So one of the other things you talked about emotions and the relationship with money, but here, this gets into those who are married. It prompts a conversation.
Exactly. And that's
especially in week 4 or week 5, as you come to having to make some of those difficult decisions and trade-offs.
Right. And that's where, understanding and being okay to have a little discussion. There'll be those mini discussions each week. And as you're now starting to budget, again, like I said, you're going to have areas that come up and you have to change things around. You're going to stumble a few times in the budgeting process because it is a skill. Like any skill, learn how to drive a car, play an instrument, whatever. It takes time. Our society and culture, we don't give ourselves a lot of grace when it comes to knowing how to budget. I don't know why, but we just assume, oh, it's just math. No, it's far more than math, as we've been talking about. It's those emotions and behaviors of what. Well, I really do want to spend this money.
So I'm thinking about the sometimes weight of these kinds of conversations in families about money. I mean, they are weighty. And I'm thinking of them as perhaps a spiritual practice that needs to be approached with peace and graciousness, as you were talking about for ourselves, for the other, because there's power in these kinds of conversations. So words that come up that have power in them in these kinds of conversations, I think about our preferences, what we deserve, maybe a sense of entitlement about what we really need.
Yes. Yes.
Deserve, convenience, what we normally have done. These are all concepts that I think are powerful that come up in these kinds of conversations. Would you like to comment on any of those?
Those two words you said there that are very popular ones that I end up working with people on because they don't realize it until they start looking at how they're actually spending their money. And those two words were it was the convenience and deserve. And, we can kind of walk through little scripts, a few little ones we've heard, convenience in our day and age, there's nothing wrong with convenience. It's up to us to make that choice of, is this a merchant I'm going to engage with because that fits with my budget? Or could I wait? Could I wait to buy this thing? Or do I have to have it in 2 days? You may say, let's say it's Friday evening, been a long week. Oh my gosh, I've put in 80 hours this week. I am exhausted. We don't say it out loud. It's like, we're going out to eat tonight or whatever, pick something.
Because the belief is, I deserve
this. I deserve this. I don't deserve a particular car, or I don't deserve a particular house, or I don't deserve particular clothing. But we sometimes have convinced ourselves, no, I work hard. I've got this job or whatever, or I'm a pastor of this church. I deserve to have this. All the people in my church have this. It could be something that goes on. I don't know. But just those two concepts, like you said, are very strong, and they're interwoven into a lot of pieces of our spending, of convenience and deserve.
Scott, I've heard you mention one of the other powerful dynamics that influences our beliefs, our thoughts, our conversation about our budget is where we live. Could you share about that with us?
Yes. Just like you said, just in just that statement, where we live, and people might say, "Oh, well, I live on this street." I'm talking a little more broadly because the one category of our budget that will influence the most number of other categories is that question of where you live. The country we live, the state we live, the city we live, the street we live, the neighborhood we live, those all affect things if you choose to buy a house, if you choose to rent a house, what neighborhood, that obviously we all know, oh yeah, that's different in different areas. Okay, how big is the yard you have? Okay, well that yard I have now may require a bigger lawn tractor if I'm doing it myself, or a more expensive lawn service if they're doing it. Or how long is your driveway? Do you live in a climate that has snow? How much is snow removal going to cost now? Because people say, oh, I want to live out in a big place. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. But then think, how does that now influence the other areas of your budget? And there's the obvious things of taxing, okay? Different states have state income taxes. Different towns have town income taxes. Not every state does. That's a factor. Your property taxes, that's different in every area around the country too. Asking some of the questions, doing a little bit more, due diligence to find out, okay, what are the actual costs to heat this house, to cool this house? What are the water bills? What are the things? What's the age of some of the appliances in here? Does it need work on the front end? There's so many factors that start to get into where we live and how it affects our budget. So I do like to at least point that out before we get real enamored and go looking on the internet for the next, this pretty house, which always can look kind of shiny and new online, and it might be. But before we get too wound up in that, let's ask some of those questions to say, okay, well, what are the other costs associated with this house? And will that work in our budget? Can that actually work?